After the Garden of Eden, humanity entered a completely different world. And this video explores what happened immediately after Adam and Eve were expelled, how life outside paradise began, and how the earliest choices of humanity reshaped history forever. When the gates of Eden closed, it was not only a place that was lost, it was a way of existence that ended. Adam and Eve no longer lived in a world where everything was provided, where God walked with them openly, where harmony between humanity, nature, and the divine felt effortless. They stepped into a world marked by resistance, uncertainty, and time. Scripture describes this transition with striking simplicity, yet the implications are enormous. The ground would now resist human labor. Survival would require effort. Pain would accompany birth. Mortality would no longer be an abstract idea, but a certainty hanging over every generation. Outside Eden, humanity learned what it meant to live with consequences. Adam and Eve began their life beyond the garden as the first family in history. They built shelter, learned to cultivate the land, and raised children in a world that no longer felt safe or predictable. Their sons Cain and Abel grew up knowing only fragments of Eden through their parents' memories. They never walked among the trees of life. They never experienced unbroken communion with God. Their understanding of the divine came through stories, instructions, and offerings. And it is here, very early in human history, that Scripture reveals how quickly the fracture introduced in Eden spread into human relationships. Cain became a worker of the ground, Abel a keeper of flocks. Both brought offerings to God, and the text tells us that Abel's offering was regarded while Cain's was not. The Bible does not explain every detail, but it clearly shows the result inside Cain. Jealousy took root. Anger grew quietly. And instead of mastering it, Cain allowed it to define him. God's response is one of the most revealing moments in Scripture. He did not immediately condemn Cain. He warned him. He told Cain that sin was crouching at the door and that he must rule over it. This moment shows that even after Eden, humanity was not abandoned. Choice still mattered. Responsibility still existed. But Cain ignored the warning, and in a field away from witnesses, he killed his brother. This was the first human death caused by another human, and it happened not long after Eden was lost. Violence did not emerge centuries later. It appeared almost immediately. When God confronted Cain, he asked a question that echoes through history. "Where is your brother?" Cain's response revealed a hardened heart. "Am I my brother's keeper?" Yet even then, God's judgment was paired with restraint. Cain was punished, but he was also protected. A mark was placed on him so that he would not be killed. This moment reveals something essential about the world after Eden. Justice and mercy now existed, side by side. Humanity lived under consequences, but also under restraint. As generations passed, humanity multiplied. People settled, built cities, and formed communities. Cain's descendants developed early culture. Scripture mentions music, craftsmanship, and tools. Civilization began to take shape. Yet alongside progress came pride, revenge, and escalating violence. One descendant of Cain openly boasted about killing others and declared his vengeance greater than Cain's. The pattern was becoming clear. Distance from Eden was not only physical, it was moral and spiritual. Humanity was learning how to build without God at the center. Meanwhile, another line emerged through Seth, born to Adam and Eve after Abel's death. Scripture notes something subtle but important about this lineage. People began to call upon the name of the Lord. This simple statement reveals that even as corruption increased, there were still those who sought God. The world after Eden was not uniformly evil. It was divided. One path leaned toward self-exaltation and violence. The other leaned toward dependence on God. Time passed, generations overlapped, and humanity filled the earth. Yet the longer humanity lived outside Eden, the more visible the effects became. Lifespans were long, but hearts were increasingly restless. Knowledge expanded, but wisdom lagged behind. The memory of Eden faded into legend, but the longing for something lost remained embedded in human experience. Scripture gives us a sobering summary of this era. The wickedness of humanity increased. Thoughts became continually inclined toward evil. This was not a sudden collapse. It was a gradual drift. The story after Eden is not just about one family or one crime. It is about a trajectory. Every generation inherited a world slightly further from the original design. And yet within this darkness, God was still watching. He observed humanity's choices, the spread of violence, and the grief embedded in the human story. The Bible describes God as being grieved by what humanity had become. This is a profound statement. It suggests relationship, not distance. God was not detached from the world after Eden. He was engaged, watching, responding, and preparing. Because the loss of Eden was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a long, unfolding plan. And as the world outside Eden grew louder with conflict and corruption, a question quietly formed beneath the surface of history. How far would humanity fall, and what would God do next? As humanity continued to move further from Eden, the world began to reveal the full weight of separation from its original design. Families expanded into tribes, tribes into societies, and societies into a world increasingly defined by human will rather than divine guidance. Scripture paints a picture of rapid growth not only in population, but in complexity. People learned how to shape metal construct dwellings and organize power. Knowledge advanced, but reverence declined. What began as survival outside Eden slowly transformed into confidence without God. The Bible describes this era as one where human thoughts became increasingly inward, focused on strength, legacy, and control. Violence no longer appeared as isolated acts. It became a pattern woven into daily life. Power was admired. Revenge was celebrated. The value of life diminished as pride increased. This was not ignorance. Humanity still knew of God. The stories of Eden were still told. The memory of divine presence had not vanished completely, yet familiarity bred indifference. God was no longer the center of human decision-making. He became distant in practice, even if acknowledged in words. Scripture emphasizes that God saw this transformation clearly. Nothing escaped his awareness. He observed the intentions behind human actions, not just the actions themselves. And what he saw was the world increasingly driven by corruption. The Bible states that the earth was filled with violence. This phrase suggests saturation, not exception. Violence shaped how disputes were settled, how authority was maintained, and how fear controlled communities. Humanity was building a civilization that could function without Eden, but not without consequences. God's response to this reality is described in deeply emotional terms. Scripture says that God was grieved in his heart. This reveals that the relationship between God and humanity had not been erased by exile. God still cared. He still felt the weight of human choices. The sorrow described here is not weakness. It is the pain of watching a creation move steadily toward self-destruction. Yet even in this moment of grief, God did not act impulsively. He prepared. Among the growing population, there was one man who stood apart. His name was Noah. Scripture describes Noah as righteous and blameless. In his generation, a man who walked with God. This statement carries enormous weight in the context of the world after Eden. It shows that corruption was widespread, but not absolute. Choice still mattered. Faithfulness was still possible. Noah did not live in isolation from the violence of his time. He lived within it, yet chose a different path. God's decision to act through Noah reveals a critical pattern in the biblical narrative. Judgment is never arbitrary. It is deliberate, measured, and intertwined with preservation. The flood was not simply an act of destruction, it was an act of reset. God announced his intention to cleanse the earth not because creation had failed, but because humanity had corrupted it beyond repair. At the same time, he provided a means of survival, an ark. Instructions were given, time was allowed, warnings were spoken. The world after Eden had reached a point where mercy and judgment converged once again. Just as with Cain, God did not remove consequences, but he limited total annihilation. The flood narrative reflects the seriousness of sin, but also the persistence of divine purpose. Humanity would not be erased. It would be refined. After the waters receded, the world emerged altered but intact. Life continued. God made a covenant, placing a sign in the sky as a reminder that the earth would not be destroyed in the same way again. This moment marked a turning point in the post-Eden story. Eden was still inaccessible. Humanity was still mortal. Sin was still present. But God reaffirmed his commitment to creation. He chose to work within the brokenness rather than abandon it. The world after Eden was now defined by promise as much as loss. The trajectory that began with exile had not ended in abandonment. It had led to a deeper revelation of God's patience, restraint, and long-term plan. Humanity would continue to struggle, to fail, and to wander. Yet history itself had become the stage for restoration. Eden was no longer behind humanity as a memory alone. It had become a future hope. And as the generations moved forward, carrying both the scars of exile and the promise of covenant, one truth remained clear. The story after the Garden of Eden was never just about what was lost. It was about what God was preparing to restore.